We are now going to assemble everything together to create our leaf branch set, and then we'll be able to combine that to create our branch group. So I now have open within View our branch leaf set file that we created before, and we're going to be creating all of the different maps that we need to compile everything together, our specular maps and our bump maps, and all of that we're going to be rendering right here within View. So we're going to start out by working on our color maps. We're going to work on our leaves and go ahead and load in. We'll double click to open up the advanced material editor, and then we'll be loading in our other materials. But first, I do want to remove our mixed material to get rid of our color variation that we have currently built in. Although we could keep that on if we wanted to. I think I may adjust what we have set for that, so I'm going to switch this to a simple material. We'll just click OK, and we can see all of those showing up correctly. We'll go back into the material editor, and now we're going to edit our function, and we're going to load in our first color map. So we can double click to open up our chooser, and I'm going to need to add in a new folder with our new maps in it. So I'm going to add in our new collection, and now you can see all of our different maps, including our branch bump that I just included with our leaves, since there's really only one extra image for that. And we're going to do our front leaves first. So select front leaf color, click OK, and OK again. And now we have our color map ready. We're going to make sure we turn on our background. Which is going to be down here under our branches. And we also need to go back to our leaf and load in the correct clip map. So we'll select our clip, and that will replace what we currently have. And there's another thing we need to consider right now, whether or not we want to have variations with the shapes of these leaves, which we can do by controlling a function, but we would have to set this up for every single map, so we need to do it on the first one, and then we could just carry it over for the others. Just to show you this, I'm going to hide that background from the render, open up the material for our leaves, edit our function, and what I'm going to use is a Turbulence node that I can attach to first a position option input node, and that way we can work with the world standard mode so that every leaf isn't going to look the same. Then with that selected, I'm going to add in a Turbulence node and connect our origin from both our clip and our color into that Turbulence. If we open up our function output observer, we'll be able to see the leaf, although right now, with our viewing options, we can't really see the change. So what we need to do is change our option for viewing our material. Go to Preview option, and I'm going to select 2D plane, and it looks like we also need to change that to 2D plane within the material editor itself. Now we can open that up, and we can see this Turbulence node already modifying our material. So we can use simple turbulence, we can use the View 4 style turbulence, and then we would just need to increase amplitude to modify that, change our wavelength if we want to affect the leaves a little bit more, and now you can really see the changes, very drastic if you turn up the amplitude too much. But what we want to use it for is just very subtle changes on the edges of our leaves. We could also use the advanced turbulence, which gives us some more options, but of course is a very large effect depending on which noise you're using. I'm going to go back to our simple turbulence. And we just want to modify this a little, just enough to make the leaves look different. And we could adjust our scaling. And also pay attention to how it's affecting the veins on the leaf, and not just the edges. I'm going to go ahead and turn down the wavelength. And we just want to create a little bit of turbulence in there, just slightly modifying our leaf shape. And that should be good. And now, since this is part of our material, all we need to do is switch out our images, and that'll apply to every map and every leaf. And if we go ahead and render this and take a look at our leaves with the turbulence, we'll really be able to see that showing up. Or it looks like in this case, we won't. So we may need to increase those values a little bit more. Sometimes the preview we get is not quite what the render turns out to be because of the scale and sizing changes of our objects that we're using. So I'm going to increase our amplitude a little bit more. And we're going to re-render that and take a look. And basically our material that we have and the object is much smaller than the preview we're seeing. So we're not seeing as much turbulence as shows up in our preview, but there is a little bit there, and you can increase the amplitude if you want to make that effect a little bit greater. You can edit our material, select our turbulence, and if we turn down the wavelength, we might be able to see that showing up a little bit more. And in this case, you just kind of play around with it until it starts to show up, because that material preview is a little bit different. But it looks like this one is showing some of those disturbances a little bit more. And we can tell now that we are seeing a lot more variation on the edges. And we can see that will affect our clip as well. And since we didn't have the background on, we're just going to use this one to save out our clip map. You can also use that same technique with the turbulence to modify your branch shape if you want to create little variations with that as well. And I'll just go ahead and close this out, and we're going to turn on that background. And now we're going to render out our top color image. And I'm going to go ahead and save that out, and then we can load in our other color image for the back. And actually, because I do want to make this as realistic as possible, I will be moving around our planes so that the overlapping leaves will be opposite for the back. So I'm actually going to go ahead and load in all of our front images first, and then we'll do all of our back images, and that'll end up being a little bit easier. What you could do too is create two different template files with those opposite leaves, the ones that overlap, and that will make it a lot easier so you don't have to keep swapping those leaves back and forth. But we're going to load in the rest of our front image maps, select our leaves, open our material, and then we're going to load in. We'll do our front bump. And we can keep the clipping map on. And then we also need to change our branch. And I'm going to turn off our background. And our color is going to be switched to the branch bump. And now we may need to balance this out a little bit more. If we take a look at the branch compared to the leaves, we have a lot more intensity on our branch bump map than we do on the leaves, and that's going to cause a little bit of an imbalance when we're adjusting these maps. And it might cause the branch to be sticking out really far, or give the appearance of it, where the leaves might not be sticking out as much. So what we can do is adjust that setting. And basically what I'm going to do is edit our function, and I'm going to create a combiner in a Blender node, and then we're going to create actually in this case we can use a constant node, constant color of white, and then I'm going to blend these two together, and we can adjust the ratio. And you might need to play around with that a little more to get the ratio correct, but that looks like it should be good. You could also adjust that overall amount down a little, but this is just a bump map. Since we can't use displacement maps within trees, we don't really have to worry about that. I'm also going to select our stems, edit our function, and basically I'm going to add in a color node, color correction, HLS shift, connect that, and remove all of our saturation. And depending on the level of how dark that is, we may need to also blend that one with another color. But let's go ahead and render this out and take a look at our bump map. And it looks like our stems will need to be a little bit lighter, but overall it looks pretty good. Another thing we could also do is, instead of blending our branch with white, we could blend it with black and tone it down, and that way the leaves will appear to pop off a little bit more. So we're going to adjust that, select our branch, open up its material, and change the constant color to black. And I think I am going to tone down that blend just a little, maybe lighten it up. And go ahead and render that and take a look. And that looks pretty good. So I'm going to go ahead and save this out as our bump map. And remember, we will be mixing our color along with this to get the finer details of both the bark and our leaves. So we don't need to worry about those finer details right now. And that's really only going to be a very small part of the bump map anyway. So I'm going to go ahead and save this out, and then we can load in our next images. So go ahead and close this out, and I'm going to select our leaves, edit our function, and next we're going to load in, and we'll do our front specular. And click OK. And now we do not want any specularity on our bark of our tree at all. So what I'm going to do is take our branch layer and our material, edit the function, and what we can do is blend this all the way to the black. So now that is completely black. If we take a look at the leaves, the contrast between these two, with our branch being black, 0 specularity or highlight value, and the leaves being so dark, we will also need to blend the leaf color with a white to brighten it up a bit. So I'm going to go ahead and create a combiner, create a constant color, which I'm going to change to white. And we can connect that and lighten it up. Click OK. And our stems will also have a higher value. So we can edit their function. And I'm going to increase the luminosity as part of the HLS shift. And now let's go ahead and render that. And what you can notice is because we're using the HLS shift, we have those shadows on the outside of our stems. So I'm going to open this back up and modify our stem so it just connects to a constant color. And we're going to make that pretty much white. And we'll just connect that. And we can render that out. And now we can load in our material for our backlight. And technically all we really have is the one for the back. But I am just going to create this one for the front, just in case we want to use it. And we can delete that blender. And we do want to make sure that our branch is still black. And the backlight of our stems, even white should be fine. If you wanted to darken that up a bit, less light would shine through, you could set that up as well. Let's go ahead and render this out. And before we start on the other side, I'm first going to load in the images for the back before I move any of the leaves, just so we have a good reference to work with. And now we can see the edges a little bit better. So I'm going to go ahead and ungroup the leaves so I can modify those. Go ahead and select them. I'm going to open up the numerics and just adjust that. I'm going to go through each of our leaves and just go ahead and switch them like I did before, so that the ones that are overlapping are now underneath. And I now have all of those switched, so I'm going to select all of our leaves and regroup them. I'm going to go back to our branch, open up its material, remove that blender and constant color, and then bring back our color map for it. And then we can go ahead, turn on that background layer, and render out our back color. And I'm going to save out our color and go through and just basically do what I did before and save out all of these maps except for our other side. And if you need to balance things out, you can do that just as we did before. So it's basically the same process as doing the front, but just with all the back images now. And I've now opened up our branch leaf group that we had saved from earlier. And what I'm going to do is select our group and load in our images and basically go through and create some more renders. So let's take a look. I need to add in our new collection. And we can see all of those images in there. And we're going to start with our front. So we'll load in our front color, and then we also need to load in just that clip map that's going to work both ways, both for the front and the back. And if you really want to see the detail that we had spent on all of those different maps, we would have to be rendering a little bit larger for our previous group, our first leaf set that we had, and also this group right now, to really get in there and see the details. So it depends on how close you want to get to your tree. You could render out much larger images And in here right now, we have 2048, and that's really going to cut down on a lot of the detail we had spent our time putting into it. So I am going to render this a little larger, and then you could go back to the other ones, render them larger if you want some more detail leaves. So it's really up to you and how close you want to get to the tree. But I'm going to go ahead now and basically do the same thing on this scene. And there isn't anything different about this than there was before, except now we don't have to make any changes to specific branches or leaves. We just have to load in each individual image and render it out and save it, and then we can apply it to a tree and take a look at setting our function settings to match up to each one of those maps. And now I've just gone ahead and loaded up the default scene, or my default scene, and we are going to start applying all of our maps to a tree species. So let's go ahead and right-click on the tree icon to open up our window. We're going to select a species we'd like to apply this to. We're going to start out with the plum tree. And since when we make this material on any tree, we can apply it to any of the other ones. So we're just going to start with the plum tree, and then we can move it over to other trees to see how it looks. And if we want to change anything, and I'm going to go to the atmosphere editor and just make a few changes to our sun value, just to balance our light out a little bit more. And click OK. And now we're going to switch over to our plum tree surface. I'm going to change this to custom advanced, and also front, because we are going to be working on the front leaves first, and then creating our mixed material to swap out the leaves and create our backside. So we'll go to edit function, and we're going to delete our bump map, and now we're going to double click on our color, and I'm going to load in the collection with the renders I just made, and we're going to select our front color and also our clip or alpha that we can invert, and I'm going to click OK and OK again because we do need to open up the plant editor and move our hooking point before we add any other nodes or textures, because once we have more than the standard color and alpha and bump and start adding a little bit more, eventually this hooking point, changing it will remove some of our nodes. So we need to make sure that we set this up first, and we can customize the tree, get a little more variation in there until we get something that we're happy with. And that should be good. Go ahead and click OK. And really I'm going to go back because I do want something a little more green and not that yellow, because we do have those built-in variations. Okay, so now we can double click on our surface, go back to edit function, and now start adding in all of our maps. I'm going to select our color first, so that when we click to create our next texture map, it already has the same settings loaded in. And we're first going to load in our bump map for the front. And then select our bump, connect it, and now we can see in our material all those nice little bumps showing up. Now, because of the low resolution that this current texture is, we're not seeing all the fine detail, but I could go back and render that out a little higher quality, and there will be renders available and higher resolution images available in the content folder that you'll be able to take a look at. And now if we wanted to increase the bump quality or the height, we would do that within the material editor outside of the function editor. But already we can see that just that custom bump really makes it look a lot more realistic. And we are seeing a shadow behind the material, which always shows up, so that is not a problem with the clip. And I'm going to move over, and I'm just going to bring these nodes down. Go ahead and move this up to the top a little. And we're going to select just one of our nodes, add a new texture map, and now we're going to load in. Let's go ahead and grab our specularity map or our highlight map, and now we can attach highlight to that. So now our bark will not have any highlights on it at all, just our leaves. And then, of course, that increased highlight along our stems and veins. And the last thing we need to add as an output is our backlight, which is shown up as color backlight. And we're going to load that in and connect it. And actually, I am going to change that to our grayscale. And that might not be the correct backlight. But it looks like it is. Okay, so we'll go ahead and stick with that for our front maps. And we haven't set up the really defined bump yet. So we're going to need to do some renders first. I'm going to increase our depth to 1 to begin with. And just zoom into our leaves. And we're going to need to make some modifications to our render settings. And change this to broadcast, render to screen. And we'll make this a little bit larger. And render that and take a look. And I do have radiosity on, so I'm going to turn that off in the meantime. I'll just go ahead and switch that to ambient occlusion, because we don't need a radiosity render at this point. And there's really not enough in the scene for that to make too big of a difference. And we can take a look at that. And we can see that our clip map doesn't appear to be entirely removing the outer edges. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is the resolution we use to render our original images once we got to our first template. The second is anti-aliasing while we were rendering. Let's take a look at that right now. If we open up our render options, we can see we have the anti-aliasing settings. Well, there are two different types. We have texture and object. Object is really important, but something I should note is that while you're making those previous renders, it will turn out much better if you have texture anti-aliasing off. If you're using a high enough quality and high enough pixel resolution image to render to get all your details, then that's not really going to make too big of an impact. But since we used something a little bit smaller, that texture anti-aliasing removed some of our detail and also made it so our clip it goes a little bit too far beyond our leaves and our branches. So we can go back and make changes to that. Like I said, I'm going to provide some renders on the content folder, and you'll be able to open that up and take a look at some higher quality renders and examples of our leaves. And there's just one thing I'm going to double check really quick. I'm going to go into the material, check out highlight, and what we can see is we have a variable highlight set. But sometimes you might want to set that to the global intensity. So what I'm going to do is actually turn on the highlight global intensity and disconnect our variable highlight. We can delete the constant that's automatically made. And now that's going to show up a little bit better rather than the variable highlight. So I'm going to go ahead and delete the variable highlight, click OK, turn off variable highlights. And if we go back into the function, now right now our highest amount, we're seeing it's at 100%, but I do want to take that down a little bit so that our highest amount is really around about 50%. So we can create a filter on there, which I did by selecting the filter button, by selecting our line, and now our right point is going to be the most amount of specularity or highlight. Right now it's at 100%. If I drag it down to the bottom, then we have 0, and around about the center is 50%. So you can adjust this value in order to change your highlight. And remember, since we have that image map on, it is only affecting our leaves and stems and not our branches, because our branches will not have any highlight unless you're working with a bark texture that you would like to have a highlight on it. Then what you can do is click and drag over to the lower left to create a new key point at -1, -1 on the X and the Y. Create that new key point and then move that point up. And what that'll allow you to do is take the lowest part of the image, lowest color, which is black, and turn that into a highlight value, something a little higher. I'm going to leave that at 0, but if you did want to increase that, all you would need to do is just move that point up. And I'm going to make that a little shinier too. You could also create maps if you wanted certain areas of the leaves to be shinier than others. Basically, I'm just going to have the top leaves shinier than the bottom leaves, and just have a global size that's going to carry over to both of our images. For the bump, I'm going to go ahead and increase that up to 2. And I'm going to render this out again and take a look at that. And we can tell that bump is showing up pretty well. In some cases, we have that bump reversed because the leaves and the polygons for our leaves are upside down. But once we create our mixed material where we're defining the fronts and the backs, that will correct that issue. And we are also going to blend together that color to get finer details available on the leaves, depending on how close you want to get to them. I may even increase our highlight a little more and adjust that filter. Just because of the type of lighting we're using right now, we're really not seeing the highlights. So I'm going to go to that filter and just increase that amount. Because I also made them shinier, if you remember. And I can tone that down just a little, and we'll just render that out. And that definitely looks much better. And if you pay attention and take a look at the branches, you can see that they look much rounder now than most branches usually look, just with the standard bump maps. And in this case, we may not even need to blend that bump together. Of course, if we're blending for the leaves, it's going to include our bark, so that's really up to you, but it depends on how far away you are from the tree. If you're going to be zooming in really close to the leaves, then of course we would need higher resolution images and renders of the original leaves we're applying. But overall, I think this looks pretty good for a starting point. I'm going to go back into our material, edit our function, and now to blend together our color with our bump, what I'm going to do is create a combiner node and blend together the grayscale output of our color with the normal mode and basically the grayscale of our current custom bump. And we want to make this much closer to our original bump and just start to bring in the finer details just a little. And of course, because the lower resolution of this image, once we start to zoom in, we're really not seeing the detail that we got within Photoshop that we were designing. So I just need to render those other images a lot larger, maybe twice the size would take care of it. Go ahead and close that out. And I'm going to do one more render, and then we're going to create the undersides of the leaves. And that doesn't look too bad. So I'm going to open up our material, and I'm going to change this to a mixed material. And we can copy material 1, paste it into material 2. And now if I double click on material 2, this is going to be our front, remember, and our first material will be the back. So we'll double click on the material 1 and change that to our back so we don't have to switch them, and then edit our function, and all we got to do is load in our back images. So double click on the color, load our back color, load in our back bump. Our transparency can stay the same. And we're loading in our backlight. And now our highlight and our spec map that we have. And we can click OK. And now for influence of environment, turn on distribution of materials dependent on local slope, altitude, and orientation. Turn off altitude, increase slope to 100%, and click OK. And now we have our double-sided leaves on our surface. And I'm going to adjust our lighting settings a little. Because of the small amount of leaves on this tree, it might be difficult to see some of our settings, like the backlight. I'm going to go ahead and increase this to more sunlight, increase our brightness. And let's go ahead and render that out and take a look. And I'm just going to stop our render here, because one thing we can see is that our bump is set a little too high. So now with our lighting change, we can really see that bump map coming out. So it may feel a little bit too much for this scene. So we're going to go through each of the materials and change our bump. We're going to start with 0.5 and see how that looks. We can also see the specular value on our different plants and sides is a little different. So we might have something that is... And I am going to take a look. And just make sure that everything is loaded correctly. And we may need to adjust that bump map a little more towards the original on the front. And it looks like the highlight on our back image might be a little too high. So we can adjust our filter for the back. And if you remember, I was also going to make it duller, because the tops are always a little bit shinier. We'll go ahead and zoom out a bit so we can see a bit more of the tree. And let's render that out. And now at this point, it's really all about tweaking. Just kind of tweaking the little settings until everything looks about right. And then once you get a good balance for your different scenes, you can just use those initial settings over and over and just kind of replace the images within your material. Now one thing I want you to take a look at is in the upper sections of the branches where you can really see the light shining through from that backlight. And what you can see is very dark branches. matching our bark, because those sides of the trees are not lit as much. And compared to the default view trees that don't have that special backlight, what you'll notice is that the branches will also shine up much brighter, which isn't very realistic. So this way, you can create a special backlight image. Another thing, too, is if we take a look, especially at this little leaf up here, which might be hard to see, it is overlapping our branch. And if it's on the underside, what you can do is take your branches and darken that area above the leaf, and that way light will shine through it, but not as much, because it will be shadowed by that branch, and that will make it look even more realistic. So there's a lot you can do, just kind of playing around with those different settings. But I think this tree looks way more realistic than you would normally have with just the typical image maps. So by having all these extra ones, if we take a look right down in the lower left of the tree, we can see the nice highlight on our leaves with that bump map. And like I said, it's really all about tweaking now and whether or not you need to increase your image resolution, but having the back leaves and the front leaves and the different curvatures with the bump really increase the realism quite a bit. And as you start moving this around to different trees, you can really see it show up more in different areas. And there's just one last thing I want to show you, and that is how we can change the color of our leaves a little bit more. And something that is global and can be used throughout ecosystems, change leaf colors. Right now we can see a really increased highlight area. And we may actually have to swap those materials around. Let's go ahead and take a look at that. And it looks like maybe some of the settings are backwards, but that's okay. What I'm going to do is take this material and turn it back into a simple material, because this is something that we would need to copy over onto both materials. So if we had two different sides, we would need to copy this function over. But this is really good technique for creating autumn trees, things like that. I'm going to open up the Advanced Material Editor, go to the Function Editor, and we're going to take a look at our tree in the preview. And what I want to do is blend our color. I'm going to create a combiner node, and I'm going to create a copy of our projected texture map with the color, which you can do by selecting that map, and then when you click to create a new one, it'll automatically copy it. I'm just going to go ahead and swap these so we know which side is being blended. And I'm going to add in a color node, color correction, and we can use a filter, or we could use HLS shift. I'm going to go ahead and change this to the HLS shift and connect that to our texture map. And what we can do is just change our hue to get a different color. And we can go into the reds, and let's get something a little more orange-yellow. And right now it's just going to be blending those two together, and we can see that showing up in the preview. But if we wanted areas of the trees to be kind of spotted, normally what a lot of people do is just connect a fractal node to the blender to control the ratio. Let's take a look. And we can see that variation showing up, which isn't too bad. It looks pretty good. The only problem is it's not based on global positioning. So we're going to add an input node, position options, which is set to world standard, and connect that. And now we'll be able to see this in 3D and not restricted specifically to that image map, because sometimes you will not be able to create the kind of variations that you want with the standard node, since leaves are typically standard mapping mode and just based on the individual object. So over the course of an ecosystem, we can use these mapping modes connected to the position option, world standard, and then you can modify the roughness and the gain. And the only thing you need to watch out for, and this goes with any form of mapping, what we're seeing is oversaturation. And now I had talked about this early in the tutorial, but I did not show what was actually happening. And what I'm going to do is increase our gain. And if we take a look at the image, what we're seeing is really, really red areas. And what's happening is that hue is coming out way too much. So there's a way to block that from happening, because eventually you'll get to a point where you start to see other colors coming in, blues and colors that you just don't want, that you did not define. And that has to do not only with the HLS shift, but mainly because of the fractal node and the fact that it's oversampling itself. So what we need to do is add a filter. And for this filter, we are going to select clamp. Now what the clamp will do is block out those oversampled colors and basically amounts. Because what we really have is, if we're working with basically 8-bit grayscale, we have 255 different levels of grayscale. And what happens is we're going over those levels. Let's say we're going into 500, 600, once we increase our gain too high. So we can use this clamp and adjust our upper clip and lower clip settings in order to balance out the amount of clipping we're allowing. So sometimes you can pull down that lower clip and the upper, and that'll balance it out more to the green. And now we're seeing just a little bit of a yellow change. Of course, if we have our upper clip set too high, we're seeing that full red, but it's not as bright as it was before, and it's already doing its job to block out those really, really high colors. So you can play around with those settings and tweak them until you get the kind of color you're looking for. I'm going to go ahead and decrease that gain, increase our roughness, and change our wavelength. And then we'll adjust our clamp a little more. And we could render that out and take a look. And now we can see those colors showing up. And of course, because the plum tree is so simple, and really the image map that's originally used for the plum tree has a lot more leaves and branches on it. So this one doesn't look perfect on it, but it does allow us to look at the leaves a little bit better and the images, rather than having everything all cluttered together. But this looks pretty good, and if you really wanted to go in depth with it, you could also connect that backlight to your color, because leaves that are changing to yellow and red tend to let more light through them. So you could connect that to that node as well with a combiner node and have that balanced out, and you can really end up with some very realistic looking trees. But I hope this helps you create some really neat looking ecosystems, because by using this function built into a tree, if we were to save the species and create an ecosystem, we could really end up with some neat looking trees and some nice looking forests during autumn. So I hope you learned a thing or two about creating custom plants, a little more beyond the first custom plant creation. And once you get your template files set up the way you want, create different branch sets, you can end up creating large amounts of trees that you need very quickly and very easily, and then just have all of your default scenes ready to go to just load in your images, and you don't have to worry about creating everything custom every time. And that Photoshop file really helps too, being able to have the ability just to access your different shapes. And once again, if you take a look in the content folder, on the CD-ROM, or if you downloaded in the folders, I do have some rendered examples of some more high-resolution trees, so you can really take a look at these techniques in action with some high resolutions and, of course, in a couple of scenes. And these scene files are also available, the template files that we were working on earlier, so you can use those as a starting point if needed.